Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Transformative Women Who Brought Us to Where We Are Today. Janine Vague was born and raised in Ohio and then earned her graduate degree in counseling psychology from John F. Kennedy University in Pleasant Hill, California. She received her undergraduate degrees from Antioch University in Santa Barbara and the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles. She has been a fan of women's history since the time she was able to read a book and began writing as an adult. She is the author of a historical fiction, The Uprisers, which is about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Her stepfather was a survivor of the war when he arrived in America that year. She was involved with the California Writers Club for 6 years. During this time, she was elected to be their secretary and then their vice president. Shortly after returning to Ohio in 2010, she began the Ohio Women's History Project. As an amateur historian, she dedicates her free time to writing about our state's transformative women who brought us to where we are today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Janine.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for attending this presentation today with Ohio Local History Alliance. So as you heard, we are talking about Ohio women's history, and the title of my presentation is Transformed Women Who Brought Us to Where We Are Today. So for some reason, there we go. So the first slide that I have here is why teachers do matter. And all these people that I have written here on the slide are teachers that made significant contributions to my life as far as getting me to be interested in history and then eventually into women's history. And the picture that I have at the bottom right of the screen here is Etna Elementary School, where I went and studied with Mr. Weaver in the 6th grade. And if you look down here at the bottom in these windows here, that's where that 6th grade class was at. Unfortunately, this building was demolished a couple of years ago, and it happened to be when I was driving down the street, but it was for Amazon, the factory, to be modernize our world. And so it's no longer there, unfortunately. But these are some really wonderful teachers. POD is Problems in Democracy with Mr. Dahlman. That was actually a class we had to take back in 1980 in order to graduate from high school. And we had to pick a topic on something in current events. Mine was on the religious cults because of the Jim Jones massacre that happened just a year or two prior to that. And he told us that whatever we were going to write about was going to transform our life, and that we would never, our life would be forever changed after writing that paper. And he was absolutely right. So, so that was my foray into history. And then Dr. Barbara Lindeman at Santa Barbara City College is where I took women's history, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So, as you heard, I write on a website called OhioWomen'sHistory.com. I'm not a history professor, I'm a psychotherapist, and my hobby is reading and writing about women's history. So, if you look on here, you'll be able to see some of the women. Here we go. Some of the women that I've written about on my website. This one is Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She was a cryptologist through World War I and II and helped us by winning the war by being able to read codes. This woman right here is Irma Bombeck. She is a famous comedian, wrote for Good Housekeeping magazine. And I actually remember her so much because my mom got Good Housekeeping magazine, and so I would see her articles in there all the time. And then we have Lily Martin Spencer. She is a painter, so this is just one of her paintings. I did an Instagram post on her a while ago and included quite a sample of her paintings for people to look at. This is Ella P. Stewart, who is the first Black pharmacist. I did an Instagram post on her as well. This is Helen Beatrice Davis. She's a teacher and an activist was a teacher and an activist here in Ohio. And, and then we have our beloved Jerry Mock. I wish we could have had her granddaughter with us today. Rita Mock Pike and I have been talking in the last couple of days, and she is actually going to be a new author on my website because she's getting ready to put together a play about her grandmother, and it's going to be called The Flying Housewife. And I thought I had turned that off, but I guess I didn't. It's going to be called The Flying Housewife, and so she's going to be writing about that on my website, Ohio Women's History. So I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, and I have a Facebook page and a group. So the next thing we're going to do is what Dr. Barbara Lindenham had us do on the first day in women's history class. And that was to name 10 women in history that are not celebrities or first ladies. So if I could have you guys do that in the chat room, write down as many women as you can think of who are not celebrities or first ladies. And I guess I will just read them off as you type them in. So don't be afraid. Go ahead and type them in. Okay, we have Susan B. Anthony. There's one, 9 more to go. Harriet Taylor Upton. Any other entries? Anybody else can think of some women in history that are not first ladies or celebrities? That's a hard one. And so, so it looks like that one was hard for people to come up with, and that's not unusual. Nobody in our class was able to come up with 10, but of course we were able to by the end of the semester. So good for you for even coming up with 2. I'm going to give you a lot more today. And then the next slide, sorry about this, but the arrow keys don't seem to be working on my keyboard. Oh, now they're working. Okay, so some of the women in history that I'm not going to be talking about today, but just to refresh your mind, is Anne Frank from the Diary of Anne Frank. She comes to us from Holland. Jeanne d'Arc, also known as Joan of Arc from France. You have Catherine the Great from Russia. Shirley Chisholm from America. She was the first Black woman to run for president. Frida Kahlo, you can kind of see her halfway. She was a painter from Mexico. Clara Barton is a Civil War nurse here in the United States. Margaret Sanger was the woman who founded Planned Parenthood Federation of America, also from the United States. Juliet Lowe, my beloved Girl Scouts founder from the USA. Marie Curie, a physicist and chemist from Poland. And lastly, we have Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president in the United States. So these are just a few of the women. Obviously, there are countless others, but just a few just to refresh your mind of some people who are not celebrities or first ladies. Today, I am going to be talking about 4 women from Ohio, and that is Maud Waite, Grandma Gatewood or Emma Gatewood, Sarah Worthington, and Mildred Wirt Benson, tongue twister there. And Maud is going to be the last person that I'm going to talk about, and she is one of the suffragists that helped us to gain the voting rights that we have now had for 100 years. And so I'm going to be featuring her in the last segment. So first we're going to start with Emma Gatewood. She comes to us from 1887 to 1973. This is a picture of her family. She eventually would have 11 children, so this was early on in the marriage. This is a cover of her book that was written by Ben Montgomery. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner, but not for this book. However, it is a wonderful book. This is a picture of a presentation of her artifacts that are in the Appalachian Museum. I'm not sure where that museum is, but if you go there, you will see it, and I'm sure you can look it up online. This is a picture of Ben Montgomery, the writer of Grandma Gatewood's Walk, and two of his aunts, because he happens to be, I believe, the great-great-nephew of Grandma Gatewood. So those are her two daughters standing there next to him. And then this is a picture of Grandma Gatewood's favorite walk at Old Man's Cave. So, oh, and I also forgot to say that most recently, Emma was written about in the New York Times in a section called Overlook No More. This is for women's history obituaries because in the past, only men were written about. So Emma was an Appalachian woman from Mercerville, Ohio. As I mentioned, she was born in 1887 and died in 1973 at the age of 85 years old. At that time, she had given birth to 11 children and endured a very horrible marriage for a great many years with terrible beatings that almost left her for dead quite a few times before she finally decided to walk out the door and start hiking and never look back. This was, of course, after the children were old enough, so you can imagine how many years it took to raise 11 children and get them to be old enough to take care of themselves. But she never lost her sense of humor. She was a very funny woman. So when she said she was taking a walk, they had no idea when she would be back. That was her sense of humor. And this time when she went to the Appalachian Trail, she was walking it at the age of 67. She would be gone for several months. And until coverage began to be noted in the newspapers, the family had absolutely no idea where she was walking or when she was going to return. And so as I mentioned earlier, Emma is featured in her great-great-nephew, Ben Montgomery's book, Grandma Gatewood Walks. And he is a Pulitzer Prize winner, as I mentioned, for another book. While reading his book, I kept thinking to myself that the gods were definitely on Emma's side. And the reason why is because of all the obstacles that she went through while she was walking on this trail. And of course, what you need to think about is that walking the Appalachian Trail, which today is 2,180 miles from Maine to Georgia or Georgia to Maine, which is the way she went, it's going to be fraught with a lot of obstacles. But back in 1955, before it was the fashion for people to walk this trail, the journey was a lot more rustic. So when Emma was on this trail, it was much more difficult than it was today. Although it does appear that they had the little symbols up to make people aware that they were still on the trail. Emma went through several pairs of tennis shoes along the way. And by that, I mean what we all used to call tennis shoes back in the olden days. I'm not talking about shoes for playing tennis in. And that was, she had a pair of Keds, she had a pair of Converse, as you can see in the picture there in the upper left. And that was what was in the museum as well. So for myself, as I was reading this, I was thinking about it because I walked a lot more shorter trails than Emma ever did in several states. And I always use hiking boots when I do my walking. And I'm an older woman myself. I'm not quite 67 years old yet, thankfully. But I can't even walk now after one child without wearing properly designed walking shoes. So to imagine Emma walking on this trail in a pair of Keds and a pair of Converse, it's just unbelievable after 11 children. And also, I don't know what the sleeping quarters were like, what they're like now, but I'm hoping that now there's a lot more hostels and hotels and different things like that. But back in 1955, she was at the mercy of complete strangers, knocking on people's doors and saying, hey, would you mind if I get a glass of water? And she had a little bit of money, so once in a while she got some food at a restaurant. There's one incident, though, which is kind of funny, where she was camping for the night in a lean-to, and out of nowhere came some people from, I believe, New York, and they turned out to be ex-gang members with a minister to help reform them. So it was kind of a neat little story there. But most of the time, Emma devised beds, believe it or not, out of flat rocks that she heated over her fire that she made. And she slept on this along with other makeshift beds that nature presented her with along the way. Part of the way through her journey, a journalist learned of her and began to write stories about her. At first, it was rather fun for her because it was unique, but then she began to get very famous, and that kind of began to wear on her. So she started trying to avoid journalists instead of courting them out. Ben's writing in his book captured Emma's diaries and helped you to imagine what it was like for her day in and day out. That's the reason why if you read the book, you'll understand what I mean when I said God was on her side. He also noted the weather conditions along the way, and one such concern was Hurricane Connie, and this pelted Emma with some really bad rains, though it was mostly behind her, thankfully. He talked about at the end of her journey being up in the mountains and she broke her glasses, and what this must have been like. You can only imagine as you're reading this book, trying to maneuver climbing steep mountains with glasses that are broken and taped up. And I think at one point she didn't even have her glasses at all. So Emma's story is an inspiration to older women. I find for myself personally, it pushes me when I'm doing my exercises not to give up so easily. And today on the right-hand side here is the picture a little bit more blown up of the Grandma Gatewood Trail. It's about 10 miles and it's supposed to be her favorite hike. I can't really imagine that she had a favorite hike though, because from what I've read, she really loved hiking. So I'm sure she liked all of her hikes. And lastly, when she died at 85, she had 24 grandchildren and 30 great-grandchildren. So next we're going to Sarah Worthington. She came to us in 1800 and died in 1877. In this middle part here, you can see a bust of her that supposedly may or may not still be in Cincinnati Art Museum. I haven't been there just yet to find out, but that was what I read about in the book that I read about her, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So right now, I'm gonna try and show you this video. It's only 3 minutes. And you can learn a little bit about their home.
Thomas Worthington was a successful businessman, member of the Ohio House of Representatives, United States Senator, and Governor of Ohio. But he's probably best known as the father of Ohio statehood. He moved from Virginia to Chillicothe in 1798 and soon became a leader in the community. Adena was the name he gave to his 2,000-acre estate. His mansion was designed by Henry Latrobe, who is considered to be the first professional architect in America. Latrobe was also the architect of the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The mansion was completed in 1807. It's one of the few designed by Latrobe that's still standing. Today, the mansion sits on 300 acres of the original estate and is open to the public. Guided tours allow you to learn a lot about the home, the Thomas Worthington family, and life in the early 1800s. Inside, the mansion looks much the way it did when the Worthingtons lived there. You'll even see many original Worthington family furnishings. In addition to being a home, Adena also served as a meeting place for notable dignitaries of the day, including the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Outside, you can stroll the formal gardens and see the 5 outbuildings. It's said that the view of Mount Logan from Edina was the inspiration for the Great Seal of the state of Ohio. The seal has been modified several times over the past 200 years, but still mostly resembles the original. Thomas Worthington died in 1827 and was originally buried at Edina. But later he was reinterred at the Grand View Cemetery in Chillicothe. In addition to the mansion, outbuildings, and gardens, a museum and education center was built with many interactive displays. An emphasis was placed on relating the personal stories of people who were connected to Edina. A visit to Edina is a trip you'll long remember. We're fortunate to still have the home of the father of Ohio statehood.
Okay, so it was when I was taking a tour of the Edina Mansions in Chillicothe with a friend of mine that I actually learned about Sarah Worthington, and the tour guide told me about a book that I could find about her, which I read, and that's how I was able to learn more about her. Oops. So Sarah Worthington was the second daughter of the sixth governor, and Sarah, like Emma, was a very pious woman. She came from a devout Episcopalian household, though after many tours through Europe, meeting the Pope and spending time with nuns, she ended up converting to Catholicism. I have a lot of admiration for women who are deeply spiritual, and I think this fascinated me more than all the accomplishments she gained as a wealthy woman. However, as her father was our sixth governor, she lived a very privileged life, yet simple all the same. As you saw from watching that video, it wasn't a very fancy looking house. Touring the Edina Mansion, which I wouldn't even call a mansion compared to other estates that I've toured, it is much more a property than house, and the house seems much more rustic to me than glamorous. The Edina estate does give you more of a sense of what life was like for people in history, though, and than what some of the other historical homes that I've been to have been able to offer. The barn is still there and in very good shape that you can walk through it. The spring storage house is still there. The vegetable garden, which they're keeping up to date every year. Although I'm sure it would have been a lot larger when they were living there, the family. So the book is called In Winter We Flourish. And I was able to find that after I left the Edina estate. And it's a horribly edited book though, so just be warned. The book was written back in the 30s or 40s. And the author, whose name I can't remember, she kept calling Sarah Sally throughout one chapter, and that had me confused for a while. Kept going back to try and figure out if that was her nickname or not, but it turned out to just be a mistake. And luckily, she caught herself and ended up writing the name Sarah for the rest of the book. Her parents were devoted to each other, as well as their service to the state of Ohio. Sarah began as a precocious young lady, but a good child nonetheless. She gave piano recitals and spoke 4 languages, Italian, German, and French. And I'm sure that must have been very nice for her when she was traveling around Europe, that she could speak so many languages. They did kind of share some funny stories about the girls growing up there, which was how I learned about that. She was married twice, but this was only because her first great love died. Her first marriage was to Edward King, and this was 5 days after her 16th birthday. He was an attorney in private practice and twice the Speaker of the House of Representatives. They had 5 children, but sadly, only 2 of their boys survived. This was Tom and Rufus. However, Tom died at the age of 31. The family lived in Cincinnati, which is where her husband had his practice. This was when all of Sarah's philanthropic work began as well. It all began when she began to help after a great flood of 1832. Later, there was a cholera outbreak, and she nursed the sick in her own home while her husband was surviving malaria in another area of the house back from his travels. So this was a family that really worked together and helped each other out through thick and thin. In 1833, she opened the Protestant Orphan Asylum, which was located in Mount Auburn. However, in 1836, her husband did die, and not from malaria, and so she devoted her years to mourning to her sons, whom she followed to Cambridge. As they were attending Harvard, she opened the upstairs of her home there to the boys and their fellow students for study groups and guest rooms. Her sons both opened their own law practices after graduation. Follow his father in Philadelphia. One of them would follow his father in Cincinnati, and the other one went to Philadelphia. And then they also both got married in a couple of years. At the age of 44, Sarah would then get married again to William Peters, which is how she got her final last name. He was a lot older than she. They were married for almost 10 years, and this was until his death as well. During this marriage, she begins to offer more support to women and children, and in between begins her journeys to Europe. What was important to her was helping women develop skills that would provide them with economic independence. She started a school for seamstresses, though this one struggled and failed early on, but there are unknown reasons about that according to the person who wrote the book. She did then open a home for delinquent girls called the Rosen Association for Magdalens, which was actually a Quaker establishment. Though if any of you have actually heard of the movie The Magdalene Sisters, which is about a school that was run by a convent in Ireland for delinquent girls, hopefully she had a lot more integrity with her school compared to what I saw in the movie. But I'm guessing she did because she was a very wonderful woman from all accounts. And it sounds like her school was a vocational school. It wasn't really a school at all like the Magdalene Sisters in Ireland. In 1848, she opened the Philadelphia School of Design, and this was a women's trade school, which is still in existence today. And I'm going to show you a picture of that before we go to the next woman. It boasts the first only visual arts college in the United States, and Sarah is mentioned on their website as founding that school. So after this college began, her son Tom died, and to deal with her grief, she traveled again to Europe with his wife and children. She thought her husband was going to join her, but he was unable to, and by the time she returned from Europe, he ended up dying, unfortunately. She would return to Europe 6 more times and began one more school called the Ladies Academy of Fine Arts. I was unable to determine if that school still exists under another name. Until her death at the age of 77, she turned her thoughts and financial resources over to convents and the church. And I didn't get a chance to add the eulogy that was written about her at the back of the book, but if you do get a chance to find this old book, In Winter We Flourish, there's a beautiful eulogy written about her in the back that really just sums up her entire life and calls her the queen of the American queen, but Sarah wished she would be the queen in heaven. That's what she would have liked. So this is the Moore College of Art and Design that I was mentioning, and that is in, I believe I said that was in Philadelphia, that still exists. Now, I don't know if any of you have read Nancy Drew mystery stories, but that's who we're going to be talking about next with Mildred Wirt Benson. Nancy was one of my favorite series of books to read when I was a little girl, and I think I read almost all the ones that Mildred wrote. I don't know if I read the ones afterwards, but I know I read at least the first 23. So Mildred Wirt Benson came to us in 1905, and she died in 2002. So she's probably the youngest person that I'm featuring today, or the one who lived the most closest to all of us. She was 96 years old, and when she died. And in that time, she wrote 79 books, and this included 23 of the Nancy Drew stories. Under the name of Carolyn Keene, of course. And these are some other pen names that she had as well. The outline for Nancy Drew was actually established by Edward Stratemeyer in 1929. Edward ran a publishing house that was famous for the dime store novels that people would find in stores. And so he would come up with a series that had quickie characters and little stories to go along with them, as well as pseudonyms for the people who were going to be writing them that he contracted with. Mildred was hired in 1929, and though the concept was his, she actually wrote and created all the details and the storylines that make Nancy Drew the beloved heroine that we know today. The writers who followed her, they were just continuing what she had already established. But Mildred was not born in Ohio. She was actually born in Ladora, Iowa. And like Sarah Worthington, she was also married twice, and for the same reason. Her first beloved husband died, and so then she married again. But both husbands were equally supportive of her lifestyle as a writer, just as Nancy's boyfriend, Ned Nickerson, supported her. It sounds as if her daughter, unfortunately, Peggy, who was from her first marriage, suffered somewhat in having a career mother, because back then women weren't so much being a career mother, and so probably weren't very good at figuring out how to juggle work and career, it sounds like. The Ohio writer Julie K. Rubini states in her book, Missing Millie Benson, which is the book that I read, that the mother and daughter relationship was quite challenging. But before being married, though, Mildred went to college first in 1922, and this is where she got her start as a writer on the Daily Iowan College newspaper. She also excelled on the swim team. And you'll hear little things that I'm going to say along the way here that if you read Nancy Drew Mysteries, you would be a little confused. Are we talking about Mildred, or are we talking about Nancy? Because writers often write little autobiographies when they're writing novels. So like Nancy, whenever Mildred dealt with challenges or obstacles in life, she used her energy for something positive. And in Mildred's case, it would be a hobby, such as getting her pilot's license, which she obtained in her second marriage, or creating another book series, because she did write lots of other books besides Nancy Drew. Her parents, also like Carson Drew in the Nancy Drew Mysteries, were also very supportive of her. And on the last slide, I'm gonna show you about Mildred. You'll get a little taste of that. Her first marriage was to Asa Wirt, and he is the one who brought her to Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where Nancy Drew was actually written. When Asa died, the second marriage was to the editor of the Toledo Blade, and his name was George Benson. And she met George because she had gone to Toledo to work on his paper. And as her daughter was an adult by now, she and George had a much more adventurous life than she was able to live with Asa. And that's where she got the pilot's license again. So the next slide I'm going to show you is a little poem that was written by her mother, Lillian Augustine. So I'm just going to give you a couple of moments to read this poem. So I think that kind of tells you a little bit about just how loving the relationship was between mother and daughter. Unfortunately, that wasn't transferred over to Mildred and her daughter, but I'm sure she did try because she does sound like a really wonderful lady if you read her book. So the next lady I'm going to talk about, and the last person I'm going to talk about, is the Honorable Maud C. Waite. She is one of the people that is responsible for bringing us to the 100th anniversary that we are having this year of having the suffrage rights. And I stumbled upon Maud when I took up the challenge of volunteering to write about a suffragist for the biographical database of NASA, the National American Women Suffragette Association. Although it was called that, in America, we were called suffragists, and in England they were called suffragettes. And if ever you get confused about that, just just pull out your Mary Poppins CD if you happen to have one like I do, and listen to the song that they sing, and you'll remember whether it's suffragettes or suffragists. Anyway, I asked them, NASA, if they could provide me with a woman from Ohio, and they gave me 2 names, and I chose Maud because she was the only one I could find information on. And also I was really tickled that I happened to have been born on her birthday, 84 years later. So as I've mentioned before, taking on the task of researching women in Ohio's history is really difficult, because while we know their names, not as much has been written about these ladies, which is very sad, and that's the reason why I try to do that on my website. Maud, however, was my first one to write an article about from scratch, because there were no books written about her at all. And this entailed a trip to Cleveland and meeting with Jessamine Yenny, the curator of the Lakewood Historical Society. She's no longer working there. She works at another place, which I don't remember. But Jess was kind enough to pull everything they had on Maud, and she provided me with a table and chair to sift through these archives and make some copies to take home and read if I wasn't able to finish reading them there. And I make a big deal out of it because the day I was there, the Lakewood Historical Society was using that house to have some huge sale. And when they weren't doing the sale, it's actually used as a bed and breakfast, and it's a place for people to get married and stuff like that. So, so it was really nice for her to go out of her way and do that for me. The second thing that was really difficult about Maud's background is that her mother, according to Ancestry.com, had 7 children and only 3 survived. Maud Edith Comstock was the last child. However, if you look on Ancestry.com, the last 2 children were girls. Both were born on August 11th and both about 4 years apart. This is something that happens a lot on Ancestry. So if you guys do your Ancestry through Ancestry.com or any other venue, you're dependent on all these people putting in their information. And sometimes people are not paying attention to dates. And Maud and her siblings were born in Middlebury, Vermont. And so I was forwarded to the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, and they were only able to locate 1 birth certificate, and it was for her sister Esther Maud. So it seems a little odd, but it's possible that there were 2 sisters and the same date of birth and similar names, but it's not the first time I've seen a child die early on and then the next sister or next child is named something very similar. So who knows, but we do know that we do know a little bit about her biographical information that I was able to research. And she seems to use her sister's, or the biographical information seems to use her sister's date of birth. When I looked at her death certificate, her husband used a different date of birth. So just a lot of confusion there. But whether there's 6 or 7 children, it's hard to know, but just be careful when you're using Ancestry.com. So Maud started out as a teacher and a principal in Middlebury, Vermont, before she and her husband and daughter moved to Lakewood, Ohio, which is near Cleveland. I tried to find her last home as well when I was driving up to Cleveland, and they've reorganized the street numbers, so I don't know what her house looked like. Unfortunately, otherwise I would have taken a picture for you. But Maud became very active in Lakewood and then Cleveland with the Suffrage Association there. She would eventually chair the Lakewood Suffrage Association. So what else did she do? She also was involved in all of these activities here, Women's City Club of Cleveland, the Citizens League, and all these other ones. The last one that you see is that in 1922, she was one of 6 women elected to the Ohio General Assembly after we did get, after women's suffrage was ratified. And the other 5 women that were nominated or elected in that year were Nettie Mackenzie Clapp, Lulu Thomas Gleason, Nettie Bromley Lowhead, Mary Martin Van Wy, May Martin Van Wy and Adelaide Sterling Oat, or Oat. But I haven't written anything on them, so I really couldn't tell you much about them. Maud was 44 years old and served 3 terms while in office. She sponsored 3 bills during this time, and these were the SB 130 sale and conveyance of portions of the Cleveland State Hospital, SB 138, which allows the state medical board to appoint visiting teachers for recognizing schools of nursing. And then the last one, SB 252, I believe is still in existence, and it's known as Lindsay's Law, which requires schools to prevent sudden cardiac arrest. Something to do with sports. I didn't really quite understand that. But from what I can make out, though, with her term in office and her date of death, it looks like she had died while she was in her 3rd term in public office. So that's Maud. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with this beautiful song, Beautiful Ohio. And if you have any questions that you want to ask me, you can put them in the chat room there. And hopefully this has been an hour and that you enjoyed the presentation. Whoop. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So if you want to